All right, we are at Lesson 9, your pre-flight checklist, emergency procedures, scheduled and non-scheduled maintenance, and hazardous flight operations. So the first step here we got is pre-flight checklist, maintenance, and inspection. Now, as we've mentioned several times throughout this course, the responsibility to inspect the sUAS to ensure it is in safe operating condition solely rests with the remote pilot in command. And as required by Part 107, the remote pilot must also conduct a pre-flight inspection to include the aircraft and control station systems checks and to ensure the sUAS is in a condition for safe operation. Establishing a pre-flight checklist not only ensures the safety of all of the crew members, it also creates a flight log that the remote pilot can use to provide proof of a chain of events that lead up to flight operation and the flight itself. You really can never be too careful when operating your sUAS for commercial purposes, and creating and establishing a flight log and checklist can help actually prove your innocence in case someone in the public domain tries to press false charges against you for perhaps property or bodily damage that you were not responsible for. Now, there are many downloadable checklist apps available online, and just be aware that some are dated or do not adhere to recent FAA changes. Remote pilots have a lot of options to choose from. We found out that if you just Google sUAS flight logging apps, you'll have plenty to choose from. So under Part 107.49, Pre-Flight Familiarization, Inspection, and Action for Aircraft Operation. So it's stated right in there, you should be following these rules to ensure safe flight. Prior to each flight, the remote pilot in command must assess the operating environment, considering risks to persons and property in the immediate vicinity, both on the surface and in the air. And the assessment must include local weather conditions, local airspace and any flight restrictions, the location of persons and properties on the surface, and other ground hazards. Also ensure that all persons directly participating in the small unmanned aircraft operation are informed about the operating conditions, emergency procedures, contingency procedures, roles and responsibilities, and potential hazards. Also ensure that all control links between the ground control station and the small unmanned aircraft are working properly. If the small unmanned aircraft is powered, ensure that there is enough available power for the sUAS to operate and for the intended operational time. And also to ensure that any object attached or carried by the small unmanned aircraft is secure. Your pre-flight checklist, maintenance, and inspection. Now, although the FAA does not provide or mandate a specific type of pre-flight checklist, one best practice is to check your sUAS before leaving the home or office and, of course, again, the job site. A typical pre-flight inspection might include the following. Now, we have this to download for you. And it would include items such as checking if the airspace is restricted or unrestricted. Do you need FAA authorization? Are there potential obstructions near the flight path? How is the weather and visibility? Is the airframe and propellers okay? No structural defects. Displayed device charged, all batteries charged, memory card installed, camera view working. So the FAA just obviously wants you to be well prepared before each flight operation. So the pre-flight checklist in part may include, you may be looking for structural or skin cracking to further inspect or determine the scope of damage and existence of any possible hidden damage that may exist with your sUAS, delamination of bonded surfaces, to further inspect to determine the scope of damage and existence of possible hidden damage that may compromise structural integrity, You would assess the need and extent of repairs that may be needed for continued safe flight operations. Liquid or gel leakage, typically from a battery. Further inspect to determine the source of the leaking. The condition may pose a risk of fire, resulting in extreme heat negatively impacting the aircraft structure, the aircraft's performance, characteristics, and flight duration. Also, smell or visual electrical burning. Do you smell any electrical burning? Further inspect to determine the source of the possible malfunction. Electrical hazards obviously may pose a risk of fire or extreme heat negatively impacting the aircraft structure and performance. Assess the need, extent of repairs that may be needed. Is your battery casing bulging or distorted? If so, further inspect to determine the integrity of the battery. Is it reliable? Distorted battery casings may indicate impending failure, resulting in abrupt power loss and or explosion. You can Google that online. You'd be really surprised. These batteries and most of these small unmanned aircraft are not your typical batteries, and we'll be reviewing that in a few slides. Control inputs not synchronized or delay. Definitely discontinue flight and avoid further flight operations. So out of all of these safety checklists and pre-flight checklists, the control inputs not synchronized or delayed is one of the most important out of all of these that you would not fly. You shouldn't fly if your battery casing is bulging. You shouldn't fly if you see any cracked propellers. But no controller inputs, obviously, you would not want to fly under such circumstances. A diminished flight time capability. Diminished battery capacity may indicate an impending failure due to exhausted service life or perhaps internal or external damage. An electrical hazard could be present. And then again, you'd want to assess the need and extent of the repairs that may be needed. And perhaps are there any noticeable sound or decibel change? Loose or missing hardware fasteners. Again, further inspect to determine the structural integrity. Loose or missing fasteners may pose a risk, negatively impacting the flight characteristics as well. Dropped objects, loose of the, objects on the aircraft, risk to persons and property on the ground. And if you are flying a sUAS that requires fuel, do you smell a strong fuel smell? Is there perhaps the fuel tank leaking? A condition that may pose a risk of fire and extreme heat, negatively impacting the aircraft structure, performance, characteristics, and so forth. In-flight emergency procedures. In an in-flight emergency, it's an unexpected and unforeseen serious occurrence or situation that requires urgent, prompt action. An in-flight emergency could be a bird strike, sudden loss of GPS satellite communications that results in a flyaway, failure of being able to retain or regain control of your sUAS, perhaps even an in-flight fire as well, perhaps of the LiPo battery malfunctioning. Now, in case of an in-flight emergency, the remote pilot in command is permitted to deviate from any rule of Part 107 to the extent necessary to respond to that emergency. And the remote pilot is then only required to send a written report to the FAA explaining the deviation upon FAA or the FAA administrator's request. In all situations, emergency action should be taken in such a way as to minimize injury or damage to property. A key part of emergency operations planning is to preempt and understand everything and anything that can go wrong during a flight operation, and then planning for your course of action. An example of an emergency maneuver might include pressing your return to home button on your remote controller, completely switching from automatic to manual mode perhaps, or reducing or increasing your altitude to avoid a bird strike, or even maintaining a safe and static altitude level until the emergency passes. Other emergency maneuvers may be necessary in the event you find yourself in a head-on collision with another aircraft. Remember, we discussed in a previous lesson see and avoid maneuvers. The same procedures remain in force here. The remote pilot in command must yield right away to all other manned aircraft. Hazardous flight operations. And again, as previously discussed, sUAS operations over people that are not directly involved as a crew member are prohibited. And sUAS operations are not allowed to interfere with manned aircraft operations. Loading the sUAS beyond its capabilities to the point of losing control can also lead to a hazardous flight, as well as not observing weather conditions, nearby structures, trees, or flying in densely populated areas. Flying near emergency responders, firefighters, or police during a crisis can not only interfere with the first responders' jobs, it can lead to creating additional hazards or injury. Now, guy wires, many structures and towers, cell towers exist that could significantly affect the safety of your sUAS flight when operating below 400 feet AGL, and particularly below 200 feet AGL. Now, most cell and broadcasting towers are supported by guy wires, and these wires can extend up to 15 to 2,000 feet horizontally out from a structure. Now, these wires are extremely difficult to see even in good weather. If you're ever hired to photograph a tower, the FAA recommends to fly at least 2,000 feet horizontally from these structures to be clear of the guy wires. Overhead transmission and utility lines, construction cranes, tall trees, flocks of birds all could promote a hazardous flight operation. Now again, we want to reiterate, the FAA only recommends that you fly at least 2,000 feet horizontally from a structure with guy wires. It is not a rule or mandate. Flying near thermal plumes, smokestacks, and cooling towers. They want you to be aware of that. Exhaust plumes are defined as visible or invisible emissions from power plants, industrial production facilities, or other industrial systems that release large amounts of vertically directed unstable gases. High temperature exhaust plumes can cause significant air disturbances such as turbulence and vertical shear. Other identified potential hazards include, but are not necessarily limited to, reduced visibility, oxygen depletion, motor particulate contamination, exposure to gaseous oxides, or icing. Encountering one of these plumes may cause airframe damage and/or motor damage or full failure. These hazards are most critical during low altitude flight in calm and cold air. When able, you should remain clear of exhaust plumes by flying on an upwind side of smokestacks or cooling towers. Again, we have this highlighted. It may be on the exam. Whenever able, you should remain clear of exhaust plumes by flying on the upwind side of the smokestacks or cooling towers. When a plume is visible via smoke or a condensation cloud, remain clear and realize a plume may have both visible and invisible characteristics. Exhaust stacks with visible plumes may still be in full operation, and airspace in the vicinity should be treated with caution. The majority of unmanned free balloons have either a suspension device to which the payload or instrument package is attached, or a trailing wire antenna extended below them. So extreme care must be exercised when flying your sUAS near unmanned balloons. Remote pilots are encouraged to report any unmanned free balloon sightings to the nearest FAA ground facility as well. And then there's also wingtip vortices. Wingtip vortices are circular patterns of rotating air behind the wing of large aircraft as it generates lift. These vortices are greatest when the aircraft is heavy, slow, and developing full power, such as during takeoff. Now, in such a situation, the wingtip vortices tend to sink below the aircraft, generating turbulence. And while it's rare that you'll be operating close enough to a large aircraft where you'd experience such wingtip vortices, it's just something to keep in mind given, how light and small an unmanned aircraft is compared to their larger manned aircrafts. Wingtip vortices created by larger aircraft tend to sink below the aircraft, generating turbulence. Flying in the wire. Flying in the wire environment, flying near electric infrastructures. The sUAS knowledge exam consists of sections and subsections of Title 14, the Code of Federal Regulations, advisory circular publications, and also several safety alert for operator publications, the SAFO. The SAFO contains important safety information and may include recommended action, and its content should be especially valuable to air carriers in meeting their statutory duty to provide service with the highest possible degree of safety in the public interest. Now, one SAFO publication dated back in August 2010 specifically addresses flying in the wire environment. Now, operating an aircraft below 1,000 feet is when you're flying in the wire environment. The helicopter community in the United States and also worldwide perform their critical operations also typically at 1,000 feet or less, and more often in a wire obstruction rich environment where an increase of accidents between aircraft and man-made obstacles have occurred. A 13-year query of the National Transportation Safety Board database indicates a total of 996 reported aviation accidents, collisions involving wires and power lines in the United States. And of those 996 accidents, 301 involved at least one fatality. That averages out to about 76.6 accidents annually, with fatalities at 30%. That's really a terrible thing, but they obviously want you to understand that flying around these guy wires and electrical wires need the utmost attention to safety and situational awareness. Proper storage and transportation of your lithium-ion batteries. Lithium LiPo batteries present a risk of both igniting and fueling fires in aircraft, cargo, and baggage compartments. To reduce the risk of these lithium battery fires, the U.S. Department of Transportation's Hazardous Materials Regulations, HMR, and equivalent International Civil Aviation Organization's technical instructions for the safe transport of dangerous goods prohibit spare lithium batteries from being checked baggage, including baggage checked at the gate or on board the aircraft. Now, the term spare refers to lithium batteries not installed in a portable electronic device. Always store your LiPo batteries in a cool, dry place and at room temperature, and never in a hot garage or in the refrigerator. Your battery charging, discharging, and storage area should be free from materials that can catch fire, and the ideal charging surface area should be cool and dry, such as a concrete or ceramic top. Never charge, discharge, use, or store a damaged or puffy LiPo battery, and never buy used LiPo batteries. Each LiPo battery must be individually protected so as to prevent short circuits by placement in original retail packaging, by insulating terminals by taping over exposed terminals, or placing each battery in a separate plastic bag or protective pouch, and take steps to prevent crushing, puncturing, or creating pressure on the battery. Proper storage and transportation of your LiPo battery. It's recommended that you always use a fireproof LiPo safety bag. The FAA says even a metal ammo box or other fireproof container when you are charging, discharging, or storing your LiPo batteries. And never charge your batteries while unattended. Now, although LiPo fires are rare, they can happen incredibly quickly and they can do a lot of damage. I personally recommend purchasing an explosion/fireproof LiPo storage bag to store your LiPo batteries in, and you can find dozens of options online for just 10 to 15 bucks each. Never also leave your LiPo battery sitting around on a full charge for more than 2 to 3 days. If by the third day you know that you're not going to be using your battery, discharge it. And discharge your battery down to about 3.6 volts to 3.8 per cell for safe storage until you're ready to use again. Never also discharge a LiPo battery below 3 volts per cell. Ideally, you never want to let the charge fall below about 3.2 volts. In order to maintain a healthy battery, less than that or lower can cause kind of permanent damage. LiPo batteries are a fantastic design. They really are, and will provide approximately 300 charge cycles before needing to be replaced. Now, there's also, depending on your manufacturer, there are a lot of chargers and dischargers that will automatically take care of this for you, so you don't have to worry about testing the voltage or seeing if they're below a certain voltage. There's a lot of discharge and charging systems out there that are really beneficial to the remote pilot. Lost link procedures. Now, you may not know this, but the small unmanned aircraft system uses the radio frequencies in the 2.4 gigahertz range and also 5.8 gigahertz. And these are the same frequencies that many home and office wireless router systems use. Dense housing and office complexes and buildings can sometimes obviously present interference with sUAS operations. The FAA just wants you to be careful should you find yourself conducting flight operations near such dense housing and office complexes. Now, a lost link is obviously an interruption or loss of the control link between the control station and your sUAS, and it prevents control of the aircraft. Now, as a result, the unmanned aircraft performs preset lost link procedures typically. Such procedures ensure that the unmanned aircraft perhaps remains airborne in a predictable or planned maneuver, allowing time to reestablish the communication link, or perhaps it's programmed to auto-land and return to home, if available, after a predetermined length of time terminates the flight or when the power source is depleted. Now, a lost link is an abnormal situation, but not an emergency, but a lost link is not considered a flyaway either. So contingency planning should include an alternate landing recovery site to be used in the event of an abnormal condition that requires a precautionary landing away from the original launch location. Incorporate the means of communication with crew members if they are being used, as well as a plan for ground operations and securing parking the aircraft on the ground. This includes the availability of control stations capable of launch recovery, communication equipment, and an adequate power source to operate all required equipment. Just take into consideration all airspace constructs and minimize risk to other aircraft by avoiding congested areas to the maximum extent possible. Now, a flyaway begins as a lost link or an interruption or loss of the control of the link and prevents the control of the aircraft. Now, as a result, the unmanned aircraft is not responding in a predictable manner. And unlike in a lost link connection, a flyaway is the result of the pre-programmed lost link procedures not being executed by the unmanned aircraft. That would create an emergency situation. Now, if a flyaway does occur while operating in a controlled airspace, it is advisable that the remote pilot notify air traffic control as quickly as possible. So it is recommended that you check with the chart supplements US and obtain the phone numbers to air traffic control if you will be flying an operation near an airport. All right, congratulations. The lessons are getting shorter. Let's review a few questions here. Who is responsible to inspect the sUAS to ensure it is in a safe operating condition? Remember, we previously said who is responsible for everything and anything? And that would be the remote pilot in command. Under what condition should the operator of a small unmanned aircraft establish scheduled maintenance protocol? Well, you definitely should establish maintenance protocol, and that would be when the manufacturer does not provide a maintenance schedule. In addition to inspecting your sUAS prior to flight, the remote pilot should also be inspecting local weather conditions, local airspace and potential flight restrictions, both. Logging your flights should include all components of your sUAS except, and that would be the fireproof battery storage bags. You want to check your remote control, your links, your drone. While conducting a pre-flight inspection, which of the following is not necessarily considered a condition for concern? This may be one of those questions that pop up on your exam. A small nick in the body. Delamination of the bonded surfaces, your drone's popping apart, yeah, that's a concern. Smell something burning, that's a concern. But a small nick, as long as it doesn't affect the flight operation, it's fine. When establishing a scheduled maintenance protocol, the remote pilot must bring the UA to a certified mechanic, document in writing any repairs, modifications, or replacement of the system component, or document all repairs with photos and/or video. Just document in writing any repairs, modifications. Keep a flight log. Good ideas. How far away should you safely operate your sUAS when flying near guy wires? And so this is a recommendation by the FAA. It is not mandated. 2,000 feet horizontally. Which is not considered a best practice in terms of taking care of your LiPo batteries? Which is not considered a best practice. But this is not considered a best practice. Wingtip vortices created by large aircraft tend to, remember that? Yes, they tend to sink below, generating turbulence. In any small unmanned aircraft flight emergency, the number one rule is maintain control of the aircraft. In an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the remote pilot in command may. Now remember, the FAA allows you to deviate from any rule of Part 107 to the extent necessary to meet that emergency. And lastly, while flying your sUAS, a helicopter enters your airspace. What should you do? Stop and hover. That's the deer in headlights response. You want to yield the right of way to the helicopter. All right, they're getting shorter. I told you these classes would be getting shorter and shorter. Press on to answer the quiz questions below if you want. And then let's move on to the next lesson where we will review crew resource management. Awesome job.